As the previous video installation had effectively laid out the general conditions of the unfolding operation within the national grasslands, which were just slightly to the northwest of the built-up area known as the DFW Metroplex, which was a gigantic urban sprawl of just over 8 million people prior to the war's outbreak, as the initial landing zone of the Air Assault Battalion of the Active Duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade, having had initially with another Air Assault Battalion from the same brigade assisted in the capture of the DFW International Airport at the opening of hostilities, with the three armored battalions coming in from the 35th Armored Brigade from the north, the east, and west. The two air assault battalions having had completely and effectively cut off all escape for the 156th Brigade Engineering Battalion, as well as a third of the 133rd Artillery Battalion belonging to the 56th Infantry Brigade Combat Team, both having had been tasked with the defense of this absolutely vital objective, as it was a massively vital objective, not only for the Americans, but for the assaulting PLA Trojan shock forces as well, as they emerged from their CCP regime properties to effectively karate chop America to the jugular, as they were within mere miles and sometimes dangerously adjacent to their objectives. As the one of two air assault battalions, having had participated in the capture of the DFW International Airport, as well as having had held it throughout the first day and a bit into the second, had returned to their initial CCP regime property upon which they had initially begun the operation, as this property contained the vast majority of their logistical capabilities as they prepared for their next given mission, which was in fact to destroy the last remaining sizable cluster of armed American citizens within the entire Metroplex itself. As all that would occur now that the PLA Trojan shock forces of the 59th Ready Reserve Group Army now effectively had total control of the city, it was not a matter of taking it so much as it was now consolidating and holding all of their gains. And to do so, they would need massive patrol efforts throughout the entire Metroplex, as they had an iron grip over this entire battle space with their phenomenal ISR capabilities, from the low-altitude quadcopter assets to the high-altitude reconnaissance drones, all the way to the highest level, which was satellite, as they could see every single solitary development that occurred within the city and could call down a wide array of firepower, mostly from the 19th Artillery Brigade and the earmarked PLAAF assets, namely the three H-6K heavy strategic bomber aircraft, the two even more powerful stealth H-20 heavy strategic bomber aircraft, a JH-7 strike aircraft squadron, a J-11 fighter squadron, as well as also a J-10 fighter squadron, all of which armed completely with air-to-ground munitions, with the exception of their pair of PL-12 air-to-air missiles as per SOP, as it pertained to the two fighter squadrons, the J-11 and J-10. As all of this available air and artillery firepower, as the 19th Artillery Brigade's forces were arrayed with their capabilities facing their sectors of fire towards the Metroplex itself, the Artillery Battalion for the operation in the National Grasslands would be from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, as this artillery battalion had been solely assigned to assist the Air Assault Battalion from the Active Duty 83rd Air Assault Brigade from the PLA's Active Duty 83rd Group Army, attached to the 59th Ready Reserve Group Army for the DFW campaign, to effectively overcome the remaining sizable American contingent of partisan-like elements, or insurgents, effectively, in the national grasslands. As, of course, as the PLA had to patrol the giant urban sprawl, they would, of course, encounter small ambushes, mainly coming up from beneath the city, from its underground, whether it be its sewer and drainage systems or maintenance tunnels or massive basements beneath larger structures. these forces would have to be dealt with for the time being above ground before effectively coordinating plans to assault them in depth beneath the city itself, as this day would come at a later time. For the time being, the PLA forces in the urban sprawl of the DFW metro area would maintain control of their gains through constant patrols, and any ambushing elements would pay dearly, as they would be seen immediately upon emerging from beneath the city for the time being, as it would take time for a sizable partisan-like threat to emerge from beneath the city. For now, the PLA was effectively in full control and would continue to exert massive firepower dominance, even over very small threats like small-scale ambushes, as they would be discovered through the ISR network and real-time AI battlefield data processing system, putting together all the pre-prepared strike packages for artillery, air power, and other assets. As we go to the map of the National Grasslands, in the initial assault phase, as the Air Assault Battalion had to effectively fly the very short distance to embark its first ground-based Air Assault Infantry Company, the landing zone had to be cleared in the center of the National Grasslands, as it had been covered in the previous installation. Within this area, there had been 1,050 total armed civilian partisan-like elements, which had been brutally smashed through a combination of two H-6K heavy strategic bombers, which carpet munitioned a large area with thousands of pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, as well as even the 77th PLA Active Duty Group Army, whose forces were roughly split in half between the Shepherd Air Force Base in Wichita Falls, as well as the Army installation known as Fort Sill in Lawton, which both areas were relatively close together, and the Artillery Battalion of the PHL-16s, or also known as the AR-300 systems of the 77th Chief Artillery Force, had pounded a sizable American campsite boasting 280 armed reactionary civilians alone, as others were beginning to flee as the initial operation had effectively kicked off, as well as also J-11 fighters dropping ordnance on the campsite as well. And in addition to the heavy strategic bombers, the two H-6Ks, the J-11 strikes, and the artillery-based short-range BRE-8 tactical ballistic missiles, or the Fire Dragon missiles, were also the artillery forces partaking from the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade, its firing battalion of PCL 181 howitzers, which were its artillery battalion, which were a highly mobile and devastating howitzer system, as it was a 155 millimeter howitzer, rained down shells on other sites and forces trying to evade the initial clearance operations of the LZ, as the two flying platoons of the Combat Aviation Company of the Air Assault Battalion had effectively escorted the initial landing operation of the Z-20 utility/transport helos of the Transport Aviation Company into their LZ. They had rained down massive firepower with their 25 millimeter chain guns or cannon, as well as also their ATGMs in the form of the AKD-21s, as well as also 70 millimeter rocket fire from their rocket pods on either side of the gunships, as this was also very devastating firepower. They destroyed another campsite with a sizable number of armed reactionary civilians, 135 in the site alone, with the rocket strikes, ATGM strikes, and 25 millimeter cannon fire, as they cleared the LZ for the landing operations of the initial landing Air Assault Infantry Company, whose forces would, upon having been landed in all three combat platoons, spread out and get into large platoon-sized diamond formations to hold the LZ as the gunships circled the LZ above to ensure that they could support the landings of the next 4 ground-based companies, which even included, besides the 3 additional air assault infantry companies, the mortar company, which was the ground-based fire support of the air assault infantry troops on the ground of the air assault battalion. As this had effectively been a highly successful operation and even resulted in the absolute and total annihilation of 1,050 armed reactionary civilians throughout this entire 1 by 1 mile area. These forces would all be landed in this secure LZ of the ground-based assets of the battalion within the hour, as in between 4 p.m. in the afternoon and 5 p.m. in the evening, as this entire operation within the whole of the national grasslands, beginning as a heavy assault and then tapering off into a search and destroy operation to effectively net any remaining survivors in the area, either as POWs or through annihilation. This would last until 11:30 p.m. at night, as in the utmost very end of day 2 of the 4-day nationwide invasion, as some battles throughout the nation would even go into the 4th day. The DFW campaign would only last 2 days, similar to the Waco operation, as the forces would then, from their LZs, begin to fan out and prepare to assault other portions of the national grasslands. The first company, having had landed, would push to the north and east towards the northeastern corner of the national grasslands to assault an area containing another 750 armed civilians, as areas to the south and southwest contained even more, as there were also 20,000 approximate refugees or non-combatants that had fled into the area with the armed combatants. Many had been annihilated in the carpet munitioning and massive artillery barrage that was now well underway. And as by 6 p.m., the initial company, having had landed after all 5 companies were landed, and the mortar company would begin to set up its firing position tactically in the middle of the entire operation within the middle of the national grasslands to be able to hit all areas of the national grasslands. The company, having had landed, first company, would arrive into the northeastern corner by 6 p.m., or effectively 2 hours after the landings had initially begun at 4, with their initial landing, as the first company, again, would be they who would assault the northeast corner of the entire national grasslands. As now, these forces had fanned out into 3 platoons with their quadcopter assets highly active, as each squad at level NCO had their combat data link and control tablet for these vital ISR assets per each squad. They now ran circuits throughout the area, acquiring vital targeting information on smaller groupings of enemy forces that might have initially gone unnoticed by the higher altitude layer of ISR assets, as the high altitude ISR capabilities had already marked some targets by this time in this area and other areas of the national grasslands. Within this area, a campsite had been discovered with constant moving in and out of this thickly wooded area where many tents had been set up, and there were many armed reactionary civilians moving about in the area, along with other non-combatant elements in this wooded area. 370 were the armed combatants, as there were several thousand non-combatants with them, as only the combatants are marked on these maps. As a Wingloom 2 dedicated combat drone had entered the area as well to support this particular operation, as over 40 such of these drone types were involved in the entire DFW metro area to support the forces on the ground, with several being dedicated to support this operation in the national grasslands also, as the forces now began to effectively hike up these hilly terrain features in this area, including the platoon in the far south of this map, as this was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map. The middle platoon, in staggered column formations, would initially all move up at the same time, as they knew all of the positions of groupings of American forces in the area who were not present in the campsite, although now that the campsite had been marked for destruction, the PLA strategic missile forces, including the 2 brigades located in Mexico, which were reinforced brigades, as they had also had called up reserve battalions that would augment these active duty forces, as the active duty battalions that made up these brigades had the more advanced and latest and greatest of the PLA's tactical, ballistic, and cruise missiles and hypersonics. The reserve forces operated older, albeit largely mass-produced systems, such as the DH-10A subsonic cruise missiles, which are very long range and carried a just over 1,000-pound payload, as the largely widely produced DF2As and DF3As were also operated by some of these reserve battalions, as each battalion specialized in a certain missile type, as these TEL-based DF2A systems were in large numbers and put away in storage and maintained specifically for the use by these reserve battalions. These would be fired en masse, not only throughout the south-central invasion sector, but throughout the country as a whole, as other reserve battalions of the strategic missile forces deployed for the invasion also operated these systems, along with DF-3As, which were even longer ranged and slightly more powerful. As the DF-2A carried a 3,300-pound payload. These were massively devastating tactical ballistic missiles, and 2 had been targeted for this campsite of 370 armed civilians. As the Wingloom 2 had effectively kicked off the combat in this area by firing 8 HJ-10 ATGMs at this grouping of forces moving through this area up this hilly, or down this hilly terrain rather, as the lines indicate. Terrain changes and variations, and the thicker brown represents wooded areas, and the violet represents tributaries and small lakes. These forces moving down this hilly terrain would be assaulted by 8 of these HJ-10 missiles and hit by 155 millimeter shell fire, again coming in from firing batteries comprising the battalion of artillery, PCL 181s, of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade supporting this operation, as their entire artillery battalion, again, was devoted to supporting this battle, as they had 56 of these very potent and highly mobile howitzers sitting upon their CCP regime properties, were able to cover a large area of the general northwest of the entire battle space, which included the whole of the national grasslands. As they would utilize DPICM ammunition as well as also HE shells, they would pound these areas massively, including from the initial strikes into the LZ area all the way into the strikes occurring now in the northeast of the national grasslands, as other areas were also being hit heavily at this time by other firing batteries of the artillery battalion of PCL 181s from the 24th. The fire coming into this area was absolutely savage, as this grouping would be the first to be hit along with the ATGMs. The flight and panic that it caused other elements in the area, as it has to be understood, this 1.5 mile by 1 mile area, the sheer volume of firepower now being unleashed could be heard and even in some cases felt for many hundreds of meters away, as this was very devastating. Entering the battle space was also a total of 20 loitering munitions of the CH-901A type with fragmentation warheads, which had been launched by one of the 2 light mechanized infantry battalions that had occupied, after defeating a cluster of armed reactionary civilians at the opening of the entire campaign occupied the Naval Air Station, as well as the other occupying the Meacham International Airport, after the initial assault from an additional light mechanized infantry battalion and armored battalion, which had then pursued the remains of the 1st of the 124th to the southwest of Fort Worth. This battalion of light mechanized infantry occupying the Naval Air Station had, with its headquarters and support companies, Combat Drone Section, fired their TEL-like truck-based 48-tube system to launch 48 of these loitering munitions into the area to support the air assault operation. As the JH-7s of the JH-7 Squadron were also heavily involved in this entire operation throughout the National Grasslands, a pair of JH-7s would contribute massively to the fighting in this northeastern quadrant of the National Grasslands by dropping thousands of pounds of air-to-ground munitions of the 1,000-pound varieties, as well as also napalm canisters, and also in other areas, cluster munitions, which also even included in this spot where one would drop 2 cluster munitions to cover a wide area with these devastating bomblets, as well as also, again, other aircraft involved as well, including this J-10 fighter dropping 8,000 total pounds of precision-guided, or laser-guided in this case, as it could also be satellite or Baidu-guided, but in this case it would be laser-guided precision munitions, onto fleeing elements below of armed reactionary civilian forces fleeing the carnage now erupting in the area. As the attack helo gunships of the Combat Aviation Company would not at this time be participating in the fighting, they, having had expended large quantities of ammunition, would do an RTB to rearm, refuel, and prepare for their next missions in this battle to support the troops on the ground. However, for the time being, they, not in the battle space, again, would be effectively ensuring all their logistical capabilities were handled, or their logistical needs, rather, were handled. As in this instance, the PLAAF airstrikes from 2 JH-7 strike aircraft, which were very devastating strike or ground attack or fighter bombers, if you will, and could carry nearly 20,000 square pounds of air-to-ground ordnance and would deliver enormous strikes to the campsite in this area, along with 2 DF-2As from the Strategic Missile Forces, called up reserve elements, as well as 2 DH-10A long-range cruise missile strikes, also from other reserve elements from both the 612th and 613th Strategic Missile Forces brigades in Mexico, partaking and assisting in this and many other operations. As the awesome array of total firepower was simply gargantuan between the involvement of the Strategic Missile Forces, the PLAAF, including contributing one of its 2 in the area, H-20 heavy stealth strategic bombers, which would, in this case, fly south and carpet munition a large area, flying at its maximum altitude of just over 55,000 feet to get the maximum spread, would effectively annihilate, with 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground ordnance, an area the size of just over half a mile in width and just over 3 miles in length, as this would wipe out another 1,000 plus armed reactionary elements, as well as thousands of non-combatants that effectively were between this area and this area. As again, this is the same tributary on this map. This area is only literally a few hundred meters apart from this area. This is the same hill in this area. This road system continues north and slightly west, while this road system effectively meanders through this area that's about to get carpet munitioned and continues moving to the south and slightly west, as this also leads out of the National Grasslands in this direction, as there are other elements, a small group of 10, that would manage to flee the area alive for the time being. The rest would be horribly pounded by an array of air-to-ground munitions, tactical ballistic missile strikes, cruise missile strikes, even ATGM strikes from a dedicated Wingling 2 combat drone, as well as loitering munition strikes. And, of course, the firepower brought to bear from the squad level of the troops on the ground as they tactically maneuvered into the area according to the guidance given to the leadership from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as well as also their combat data links showing them exactly where American forces were before the Americans even knew there were PLA troops approaching them, and from even which direction, as the sheer pandemonium of the opening strikes caused from the artillery and ATGMs, followed by the DF2A strikes on the campsite and one of two JH-7s pounding the campsite with 4 napalm canisters and 8,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions, as well as massive artillery bombardment. This entire wooded area would be left as flattened, cratered earth with nothing but splinters remaining of any remaining stumps that were even left in the ground, as the other JH-7 would pound this grouping, now trying to flee in different directions in total panic as everybody was scrambling for cover, as they would not be successful, of course, because the air power brought to bear could pound them into effective nothing, or dust, pound them into the ground with all these munitions. There was nowhere to seek cover from this type of firepower, as the other JH-7 entered the area, dropped 2 of its cluster munitions, which had a wide spread, as well as also an additional 10,000 pounds of free-fall air-to-ground munitions in a dive-like attack, which had a decent spread, and annihilated this entire grouping with the cluster munitions, as these enormous strikes from the tactical ballistic cruise missiles and JH-7 upon the campsite annihilated not only the 370 armed civilians that were in the tents and in the area, but also the few thousand non-combatants in this thickly wooded area along with them or near them, as all of this pounding could be felt on the Richter scale as it was so massive, including the 8,000 pounds of precision-guided munitions dropped on this grouping, as by then, as the airstrikes begun, this group had made it to the base of this hill, and this group was now moving through this area as the PLA troops had already moved in and were now approaching them to assault them from different directions, as in the north, this northern grouping would, upon moving here, begin bounding and covering and laying down fire on these groups as they opened fire first, as these groups, which were effectively sedentary for the time being or staying in this particular area between these thinly wooded and thicker wooded areas here and here, they would be assaulted first, and a firefight would ensue that would last for some minutes. As this group would end up trying to retreat, they would be cut down by the time these forces, now tactically bounding and covering with interlocking fields of fire, as in wedge formations, they could fire in 2 different directions or all could fire straight ahead. They, with interlocking fields of fire, bounded and covered tactically, closing on these forces, getting within grenade range, and wiping out the remaining survivors of them that were still left after the initial firefight had ensued. The PLA would have some wounded in this operation, but none critically. Most would be effectively limb hits from rifle ammunition, and again, because the armed reactionary civilians had a wide array of different small arms types, there was no standardization with their weaponry, as they carried everything from sporting rifles like this AR-15, which were effectively military patterned rifles, or AK-type rifles, or also shotguns, which were a horrible choice for long-range engagements, especially against troops wearing body armor, as well as also pistols of different types and even hunting rifles of different types. The first lieutenant who had effectively managed to escape, who was an XO of one of the rifle companies from the 1st to the 124th, who managed to escape by using drainage systems and sewage systems to effectively get out of the white settlement area and begun to use wood lines to try to escape towards the national grasslands on the first day of the invasion. Upon having had made it and trying to organize troops in this area, he was actually the highest ranking Army officer from the entire 56th Infantry Brigade combat team that managed to actually escape and make it out of the built-up metro area. As he was only a first lieutenant, he was the executive officer of one of the rifle companies from the 1st of the 124th, namely the rifle company that had been engaged by the light mechanized infantry battalions comprising companies and had been destroyed as a result. He had escaped and made it to the national grasslands and tried to organize these 5,000 plus armed reactionary civilians into an effective fighting force of partisan or insurgent type elements. And he had a tall order to fill in this regard, as the armed civilians ranged from experience and fighting capacity from fairly well to effectively no experience or capabilities at all. From militia type armed civilians who were better organized and had body armor, Kevlar helmets, and somewhat standardized weaponry, to armed reactionary civilians that effectively came in their street clothes and carried very little ammunition and whatever weapons they had on their person. And organizing any type of logistical capabilities for a force like this was a nightmare. And many of these armed civilians, again, could only carry on their person what they could carry. And the very few vehicles that made it here on day one had ammunition that they could only carry in their vehicles as well, which was not very much and would not last very long in a high-intensity battle, as these forces would be methodically wiped out by the vastly more professional and quasi-elite air assault infantry troops backed up to the hilt by all manner of firepower, from their air power from the PLAAF to the strategic missile forces firepower to the artillery firepower of neighboring units in the area. Again, the PCL 181 Howitzer Battalion of the 24th Light Mechanized Infantry Brigade. And of course, their own built-in fire support capabilities from their mortar company, as well as also their attack helo gunships, which were soon to return after having had effectively done an RTB for 45 minutes as the ground crews worked like race car pit crews to prepare them for their next operations, as they would return a full hour after they had done their RTB, as it took them a roughly 4-minute flight time to return to the battlefield, and then they would have to spend several more minutes fanning out to support the forces as they moved on the ground into position. As again, the ground-based troops moved at a much slower pace. Although they were effectively jogging and moving at a fast tempo, they were still on foot and were moving at a slower pace, of course, than the helos in the air or the motorized and mechanized forces of the other units of the PLA. And hence, the fire support had to effectively keep up with the movement of these forces, as in they had to effectively slow down their movements to support these forces as they moved into place. As this operation had one combat platoon of this air assault infantry company moving up the middle to assault two groupings of armed reactionary civilians trying to flee from the destruction in the northeast quadrant of this battle space. In the south, there were several other groupings that would be engaged by the southernmost combat platoon, as on the right flank of the center platoon, the southern platoon was to mop up the eastern quadrant of the battle space, while the center platoon would sweep to the northeast and effectively conduct a BDA over this particular area that had been smashed by everything from ballistic and cruise missiles to airdrop munitions, and of course, even smaller and less powerful but still destructive ATGMs, and very powerful artillery bombardment in this area, as these were more than single shell strikes. These were multi-shell strikes, as repeated shell strikes had come into the camp and this wooded area, as well as striking this somewhat sizable grouping trying to escape along with the ATGMs. And as a result, effectively there was nothing left in this area but for a battle damage assessment to be conducted upon first having had annihilated these groupings of armed reactionary civilians in the area. So this grouping, again, had moved into this area by the time these forces begun to bound and cover, as these two squads here on the southern platoon had shifted to the slight northeast, and now bounded and covered tactically to the top of this hill and ambushed these forces who had no idea on the other side of this summit of this hilltop there were PLA troops moving ahead to assault them, and they were all wiped out by the time they moved through this wooded area and this summit of this hill. As they got to this point, all of which were wiped out as they begun to take fire when they were at this position, and they begun to move to try to get out of the kill zone, but were completely annihilated. And they were also struck at the same time, of course, again, by loitering munition strikes, now scouring the battlefield with their very powerful fragmentation warheads. As again, the CH-901A could be equipped with fragmentation, HE, which was high explosive, or heat, which was high explosive anti-tank munitions as their warhead types. And these were the CH-901A fragmentation warheads, and these were absolutely devastating to soft-skinned vehicles, both civilian and military, as well as also clusters of infantry-type forces or dismounted forces, such as these armed civilians on foot. They were completely pummeled and smashed by loitering munitions and interlocking fields of fire, as these tactical movements, the bounding and covering, laying down fire so that they could then move ahead and lay down fire as they closed on their enemy elements, completely and totally wiped them out. As also this squad here in the center of the platoon and this squad right here in wedge formations had interlocking fields of fire to cover this entire area, which effectively wiped out this grouping and this grouping here with interlocking fields of fire and loitering munitions strikes into these groups. As these forces in the center, as there would be a battle over this hilltop, as these troops then moved into position along the wood line and laid down fire on this grouping with, again, interlocking fields of fire. These armed civilians in this grouping were now moving up this hilly terrain and would be annihilated by these three squads firing right into them as they moved into this area. As these forces were also hit by loitering munition strikes, and it completely and totally wiped them out with ease. No loitering munitions hit any of these forces here in the north. It was simply just a combination of small arms fire mixed in with anti-personnel RPG rockets, hand grenades, 35 millimeter grenades, like so, from beneath some of the rifles of troops armed with these, and light machine gun fire. Again, some of these PLA squads carried general purpose machine guns too, like the Type 67, which was a larger caliber round than the 5.8 by 42, which was a very effective small caliber high velocity round. The 7.62 by 54 was even longer ranged and was a much heavier round and packed a larger punch. And some squads in each platoon had a general purpose machine gun of this type, the Type 67, and laid down heavy fire with all their weapons in tactical formations, whether in line formations or whether fanned out in wedge formations, dropping in the prone position, using terrain to their best advantage for cover. They would lay down heavy fire on the armed civilian elements, firing back at them. Some of these firefights, again, would last minutes, while others would be much shorter, because the PLA effectively was conducting ambushes because they opened fire first due to their ISR advantage, as they had total ISR dominance over the battlefield, meaning that the PLA troops could see where exactly the armed civilians were long before the armed civilians even made contact with them, as in exchanging fire. And this effectively got the armed civilians totally wiped out, as they had no recourse against these capabilities whatsoever at all. And the total quasi-elite status of these air assault infantry troops and their mastery of battle tactics. As they moved through the area, they again gradually wiped out the stragglers in this quadrant of the map, as these staggered formations would change into wedge formations to tactically adapt to the situation upon reaching the hilltop, and then bounding and covering tactically with one another, laying down fire against these forces moving into this hilly terrain. As they moved slightly uphill, they were in a slight decline from this elevation here, as indicated by the elevation markers. So fire was being vectored down into these forces, as this squad right here had made it to this wood line. They were partially concealed in a wooded area as they laid down fire straight ahead from their position, and in a wedge formation, they were all opening fire ahead, while these two wedges on the end, on each end, laid down fire in an X or almost basically an L vector of fire tactically into these forces, wiping them out as this squad fired ahead. They were completely trapped in this slight decline as they moved up the hill into this area, and were wiped out as a result. In this area, the southernmost platoon on the map of this company forged ahead after completely annihilating these groups by opening fire on this grouping first from these positions. They bounded and covered in this area downhill. They laid down fire on this grouping before they could make it all the way up the hill, while this squad here in the center had, in their wedge formation, laid down fire on them as well before bounding and closing on what remained of these forces, who they were also opening fire on when they were in this position too, because again, they could vector fire into this entire area. Again, this was a 1.5 mile by 1 mile map, 1.5 east-west, 1 north-south, and they were well within range of their small arms to cover this whole area, this squad and this squad, from their positions here and here. And as a result of the fighting up north, again, with just using their simple small arms with their total ISR advantage, had wiped these forces out, and as these forces tried to retreat from the area, they were continually fired at until they were destroyed. Again, no loitering munitions in this area, but this grouping would flee the area and be pounded by artillery called in through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, putting together strike packages, as it didn't happen in this area because the firefight effectively was over before artillery was even able to be fired at these forces. That's how quick and efficient this platoon acted against these forces, using their ISR advantage as they rapidly bounded towards them and closed to within grenade range of these enemy forces. As they cleared the battlefield in this particular area, they had wiped out, by the time it was over, 750 additional armed civilian combatants. Again, a small group would flee the area only to be mopped up in the later to occur search and destroy operations, as this company would conduct their battle damage assessment and fan out to have fields of fire that covered this entire area in a crescent shape. They later would again conduct their patrols for search and destroy operations. For the time being, they would hold their positions and consolidate their gains in this area, or effectively just hold down the area and secure it, to ensure that there were no further enemy combatants trying to even pass through this area, as they would continue to have their ISR assets running circuits. Many remaining small groups of armed reactionary civilians would hide in wooded areas and hold still to their best ability to try to avoid being seen, and utilizing coniferous trees such as pines and juniper trees to camouflage their IR signatures, as these types of plants help immensely in that type of capability. And again, they would do their best to hold still if they wanted to preserve their lives, and many would until the search and destroy operations begin to look for them. as this would be a nerve-wracking test of willpower between the later to patrol PLA air assault infantry troops and the armed civilian combatants who would be doing their best to hide in thickly wooded areas to conceal themselves and make their best attempt to try to hold out against this ruthless and savage enemy, which was the PLA air assault troops. As later in the operation, as the first lieutenant had effectively been discovered as a partisan leader through interrogations of prisoners of war captured, having had been caught in this general area, having had come in and out of the national grasslands, trying to either look for family members or other survivors to try to bring them back with them, tell them that there was a refuge here, at least for the time being, on day 1 and into day 2. They had been captured and interrogated viciously by PLA forces, which effectively was a highly important way, even in modern warfare, to glean intelligence on the current battlefield conditions, as it was vital to understand what types of threats existed in the battle space in order to most effectively deploy troops and equipment to the trouble areas. And as armed reactionary civilians were effectively trying to regroup and possibly establish resistance elements, partisan groups, or insurgent elements, basically, the PLA, having had captured the city, capturing this vital node according to their 4th generation warfare doctrines, having had held the node and allowed for the seamless and easy passage of Group Armies 7 through 13 through I-35E and W by around midnight to 3 a.m. in the morning on the first and second days, as they had entered the area just before midnight and passed through and conducted logistical operations and left fully the entire mass of huge group armies by 3 a.m. heading further north. The node still had to be held and had to be controlled. Again, capturing it was very easy, but holding it would be another thing, as the war would enter a new phase of massive partisan uprisings and insurgencies. And again, the Americans would have a devastating learning curve as it pertained to this, because they were not yet ready to take on a force as mighty as the PLA or even many of their coalition allies. And as a result, the Americans would lose heavily against a force that had total ISR, firepower, and AI dominance, as well as other forms of information technology dominance, and also numbers dominance in terms of having concentrated forces in small areas, at least initially, before they would then fan out to clear tertiary areas beyond secondary areas, as this node of DFW could be considered a primary area within the 4th generation warfare doctrines, wherein the CCP regime properties secretly containing the Trojan shock forces are located before they would capture their primary area, then fan out into secondary areas, and then finally, after the nation was effectively defeated, begin to clear the tertiary areas. Because once the primary areas and secondary areas were controlled, the nation was effectively finished as a sovereign nation, and all that would be left were the outlying human settlements, which were smaller towns and areas beyond the major, medium, and some small cities that were located along major transit routes, as all transportation networks and grids would be under the coalition's control, as well as also all of the major and medium cities, and again, some small cities that were along the way, along transportation corridors, and all the military installations having had been crushed effectively meant that the military victory was assured and the nation was effectively under the control of the Chinese and was now a Chinese colony officially. But those elements of the population that refused to be enslaved by the coalition forces would flee into tertiary areas, into the woods, and begin to regroup, as well as others having had fled beneath the city in its massive labyrinth of underground basements, maintenance corridors and tunnels, as well as drainage and sewer systems, which would protect them for the time being before the PLA would have to launch many determined assaults underground to storm these areas and cleanse them, which they would never completely be able to do. Although years into the war, they would get close in many cities. Again, this would be a very tough fight underground, as it was one thing above ground where they controlled everything in terms of ISR and firepower dominance, but underground, many of these enormous capabilities of the PLA were effectively nullified, as they could not, of course, bring these capabilities to bear underground, as in terms of artillery, in terms of armored vehicles, in terms of certain types of missile systems, in terms of their wide range of tactical ballistic and cruise missiles, although there were bunker busters in terms of the tactical ballistic missile category. But again, these would only have a limited effect against the enormity of underground networks beneath large cities. And again, they would also use nasty chemical weapons, including the deadly fent, or a weaponized opioid, which was highly devastating even in small amounts on large populations. And this would perhaps be one of their most effective weapons they would deploy underground, including with their new drone platforms that were specifically designed to release these nasty weapons, as well as also, in some cases, even contaminating local water supplies with it. This was a ruthless, enormously destructive, total war. Effectively, it would be worse than what occurred in Operation Barbarossa in terms of what the occupation forces in the USSR did to Soviet cities and towns. This would be infinitely worse, as the PLA forces would be effectively doing everything in their power to hold their gains in their newly acquired colony, which meant resorting to the utmost savagery imaginable by anyone in any war at any time. This would be a highly devastating conflict, and the American population would dwindle after many years of it, going from just over 330 million all the way down to 40 million by the time it would finally come to its end, as the firepower and industrial capacity of China brought to bear against this land was far too much to bear. But on the other hand, the fighting spirits of the partisans would never die out all the way to the end, making this the most brutal war ever fought in all human history. As the northeast quadrant of the national grasslands, by 8:30 p.m., was effectively under the control of the air assault PLA troops of their first company of their air assault infantry. As this battle was beginning to wrap up in this northeast quadrant, other combat was already in full swing in terms of other areas of the national grasslands, other areas that had larger numbers of armed civilian combatants, as the fighting that would occur in the south and southwest would be especially savage, with even more firepower brought to bear in these areas by the PLA and PLAAF and strategic missile forces, as the special operations forces would be utilized in the operation, although in a very small quantity. Their chief role would be the capture of the partisan leadership, namely the first lieutenant, as again, POW interrogations had discovered that they had a leader attempting to organize matters in the national grasslands amid those forces, and he being a first lieutenant or a former executive officer from the 1st of the 124th, the Cav Squadron, or effectively a battalion. The first lieutenant
had organization skills. Although he was a junior officer in the Army within the National Guard, he still had enough capability and knowledge to do his very best with what he had. And he was making honest, earnest attempts to organize the American armed civilian population and even recruit among the non-combatants to form a sizable and formidable partisan uprising force. Although this would be totally annihilated, as the PLA, although they had set the national grasslands on the back burner as the first day, effectively required the utmost priority be given to the metro area, especially along the I-35 corridor, to control all of it. The national grasslands, now on day 2, were to be mopped up, as, again, they were a lower priority on day 1 than was the built-up urban sprawls. This absolutely, with all of its major objectives and highway networks, had to be brought under full control before mopping up operations could begin, as it gave the armed civilians in the national grasslands slight breathing space. It was not to last, and it didn't last very long at all. It lasted just under 2 days, as the fighting, again, would be very heavy, very savage. The first lieutenant would never be able to organize all of these different groupings of armed civilians with their wide array of weapons and skill sets and capabilities into a formidable forces. The time would not be available to achieve this, as the special operations troops would contribute only one squad from one operator company of standard operators from the 59th Special Operations Battalion, from the PLA's 59th Ready Reserve Group Army, to conduct the capture operation. And they would not be using their standard ground transport or their wheeled vehicles to transport them into this operation. They would be brought in via transport helicopter, a Z-20 from the Transport Aviation Company, would bring them to within immediate vicinity of the first lieutenant for the capture operation, effectively dropping these troops off exceedingly near his location, within a few hundred meters. And this, along with the sniper spotter teams deployed, would contribute massively to the capture operations, which would occur later in the battle, as the position of the first lieutenant would be exactly discovered, as he was still even wearing his uniform, which made it exceedingly easy for the ISR assets to keep tabs on him when he was discovered. This would guide, through the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, a special operations squad of 10 highly elite troops to conduct this capture operation, along with, again, sniper spotter teams being dropped off a bit later in the operation to support this. The quasi-elite air assault infantry troops were already highly capable as a fighting force. The special operations forces were even more elite and more specialized in terms of certain types of specialty missions, which included capture operations, as the intelligence value of a partisan leader, regardless of who he was or how big of a partisan element was being led, contributed immensely to intelligence value through interrogations. This first lieutenant absolutely had to be captured without a doubt, as the PLA, again, needed vital intelligence at all times to ensure control over their occupation zones. As, again, any and all threats needed to be identified immediately and dealt with immediately, as the intelligence value gleaned from any type of leadership assisted in the deployment of resources and troops, and even updated the AI on the goings-on to allow it to even better advise the forces. This was how advanced the real-time AI battlefield data processing system was, besides calculating a wide array of different factors, everything from terrain to city maps to building layouts to sewer layouts, or underground passage layouts, to the types of weapon systems, their levels of destruction, when and where they're safe to use, including even certain types of maneuvers and tactical formations and strikes. as again, this prevented enormously friendly fire casualties, as well as also again economizing firepower and making it more effective and more lethal and more accurate than was ever before conceivable or possible. Many people cannot conceive of this, but this is the power of this type of system. China absolutely possesses it, as they are the world leader in AI, and also Russia has very similar capabilities as well. And in this invasion, they combine their capabilities together to dominate in battle. And comparatively with the defending forces, during the initial 4-day invasion, the invaders lose very few troops. As the battle would continue, as the fighting in the northeast quadrant of the national grasslands had been going on, by 7 p.m., as this battle was in full swing, fighting would break out to the south and southwest of the landing zone area, as there would be thousands of other armed reactionary civilians and many thousands of non-combatants that would be outright annihilated in the fire that was being levied upon them from various systems and platforms, making this an excessively destructive operation. As again, to the immediate east of this 1 mile area, the initial landing zone, and just to the south of the northeast quadrant, a massive carpet munitioning air raid by one of the two H-20s had occurred, which wiped out just over 1,000 armed reactionary civilians hiding out in that part of the national grasslands, as well as also thousands of non-combatants, as 90,000 pounds of air-to-ground munitions were dropped in that area. And again, to the south and southwest, there would be even more heavy fighting, which would involve many different platforms and systems and weapons, capabilities, munitions. The additional several thousand armed combatants remaining, along with the many thousands of non-combatants, would be mostly wiped out, although the non-combatants, which were seen as collateral damage, would effectively be given free passage away from the battle space as seen by the ISR assets, as they would not be deliberately targeted so long as they did not deem as long as they were not deemed any sort of threat by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system. And thus, groupings of them would be allowed to pass out of the area through different refugee corridors that would not be struck deliberately by the PLA or PLAAF, although again, if they were seen with any combatant elements, they would be struck by all the different systems. But for the most part, the collateral damage in this battle would be excessively heavy, and many lives would be lost, as the wide array of firepower was simply gargantuan. More to come in the next installation of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting fourth generation warfare doctrines utilizing a Sino-Russian coalition invasion.